I'd like to first start by welcoming you all to this webinar where we will be talking about a proposed new conservation agreement for bumblebees on energy and transportation lands. My name is Iris Caldwell. I'm at the Energy Resources Center at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And I'm joined by my colleague, Megan Petritis, who has been key in our administration of the Monarch CCAA, which many of you are familiar with. And then also Dan Salas, who's at Cardno, now Stantec, also very involved and familiar with the Monarch CCAA. And we're excited to walk you through some updates as well as some of our current plans and thinking for next steps with a second companion agreement for the Monarch CCAA. Just a couple of quick logistics items here before we get started. First is all of you are in mute or on mute, just given the size of our webinar today. If you're having any sort of technical issues, feel free to submit those questions or issues in the chat box, and I'll be trying to respond to those as needed. You also use that same chat function to submit questions. And we've allotted some time at the end of the webinar for some Q&A, but I encourage you to submit any questions as they come to you throughout the presentation in the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can at the end. We are also recording today's webinar, and we will post a recording of the webinar on the website for the Rights of Way as Habitat Working Group, and we'll send out a link to that recording again after today's webinar. So with that, want to launch right in to our presentation. And first, we had a question for all of you. This is a new topic for us and a new interest area looking specifically at bumblebees. And so we're interested, what brought you here today? So I'm going to launch this poll. We'll take just a couple of moments here to respond. If you can indicate one or more reasons that brought you here to the webinar, what interest you have in bumblebees, or how did you hear about the webinar? This will be helpful as we proceed with our discussion. Looks like almost everyone has voted here. We'll give you just a couple more seconds. Okay, great. And let's see, I think I can share those results. So it looks like most of you were interested in updates about the Monarch CCAA and this future agreement that we're talking about, general interest in bumblebee conservation, as well as concern about future regulation or ESA listings, general interest in getting involved, about a third of you, and a couple of you are also here on someone's recommendation. So welcome again, excited to have you here. And we will launch right into our presentation today. I'm going to first turn things over to Megan.
Thanks, Iris. So this webinar comes at a very timely part of the month because on Friday it is World Bee Day. So however you're celebrating on Friday, please drop that into the chat. We'd love to know how you're celebrating all that is bee on Friday. So World Bee Day actually started in 2017, and Slovenia really pushed for this. They have kind of a rich history when it comes to the bee. And what this day is for is it aims to highlight the importance of protecting bees and other pollinators, and it reminds us of how we are dependent on the bee for pollination and agriculture, as well as drawing public attention to these issues as the bee has been suffering from biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation.
And we thought it'd be fun to start with a couple of bumblebee trivia questions. So I'm going to launch another poll here. Interested in what your thoughts are on native bees and approximately what percentage of the world's flowering plants are they responsible for pollinating? Looks like about half of you have responded. And it looks like we have some bee experts among you. Most of you are answering correctly. The answer is 80%. So 80% of the world's flowering plants are specifically pollinated by native bees compared to other pollinators, which is pretty incredible. One more trivia question we have is, how many bee species are native to North America? Just a couple more seconds to put in your vote. Okay, this one's a little bit trickier, and it is pretty impressive. I see many of you thought 800 native bee species in North America. The correct answer is actually 4,000. So an incredible 4,000 bee species in North America. I've read that approximately 10% of those have not been identified or described in detail. So there's a large amount of uncertainty for some species. There's a total of 20,000 or more bee species around the world, but here in North America, there's 4,000. So in kind of appreciation of the bees among us, again, we're excited to focus on this topic for today's webinar. So back to you, Megan.
Okay, so the bumblebee and bees in general, I would say there's a lot of misconception that comes with the average person because as we've learned, there's around 4,000 native bees in North America, and around 49 of those species are bumblebees. So most people only think of like the honeybee or think that there's only a few bee species out there, but there are quite a few. And what makes the bumblebee different than the other native bees is they live in colonies of around 50 to 500 individual bees. And these bumblebees perform buzz pollination, which is essential in agriculture for specialty crops like tomatoes, peppers, and blueberries. And of those 49 species of bumblebees, 28% of those bumblebees in North America are classified under some level of extinction risk. So hopefully that's where we come in today, and we'll learn more about what we're proposing later. So the causes of declines, bumblebees that are commercially reared for agriculture tend to transmit diseases to the wild population. Also, with urban sprawl and building upon bumblebees' habitat, there's a lot of habitat loss happening. And with the widespread use of pesticides, this further degrades their habitat because it kills off the flowers that they need, and also can poison the pollinators themselves. And then another large factor is climate change. This affects the bloom time and subjects pollinations to these fluctuating temperatures and extreme weather, which really hurts the bees' chances of survival. So now that we're kind of warmed up on kind of the history of World Bee Day and some fun facts that come along with bees, today's agenda includes, we'll give a Monarch CCAA update, as this relates heavily to the Bumblebee agreement we'll be talking about. And then we'll be going into what we're proposing for this Bumblebee agreement, as well as next steps. And then we'll leave some time at the end for any questions or comments you may have. So the nationwide CCAA for monarch butterflies, this is, for those of you who don't know already, it is the first nationwide CCAA, and it was finalized in April of 2020, so we just came up on its second year in being enacted. And the purpose of this Monarch CCAA is to provide benefits, both immediate and long-term, to monarchs and also other pollinators. Also, another objective of the Monarch CCAA is offer some sort of regulatory certainty and operational flexibility for partners that enroll. That includes energy companies and transportation agencies. The CCAA aims to create more than 2 million acres of habitat for butterflies. And to date, we've had 35 applications from different energy companies and transportation agencies.
So I'll just pop in with one more poll here. Final trivia question for you all related to the Monarch CCAA. Based on what Megan just said about the number of applications that we've received to date and our goal of achieving 2 million acres of habitat, our trivia question is, do you know how many acres of monarch habitat have been committed by the 35 current CCAA applicants? There's a couple more seconds to vote. Okay, close the poll. Some good guesses. The correct answer is just over 800,000 habitat acres. So we, again, are extremely pleased with the level of participation we've seen from our industry participants to date. Those 35 participants or partners operate in 39 US states and collectively, again, have committed over 800,000 acres of habitat. So a great achievement in the first 2 years of the agreement's existence.
So the agreement has received a lot of recognition over the past 2 years. It's gained national attention as it is the first of its kind, and it's been highlighted in different industry meetings, webinars, podcasts, and articles. And you can see to the right a few examples of a few of those articles that we've seen the Monarch CCAA be mentioned in. We've also heard from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service leadership that they recognize the Monarch CCAA as a conservation success. And it's been acknowledged as an important contribution to voluntary conservation in the White House's first America the Beautiful report. And we've also been able to reach new partners through this agreement in the energy and transportation sectors. When this agreement started, it was a smaller working group that worked on it, but since then, as I mentioned earlier, we've had 35 applications to date, and obviously that will just grow over time. So at the end of 2021, all the enrolled partners submitted annual reports to us detailing what they had achieved to date. So to give you a little highlight of the numbers that we've received at the end of 2021, the total enrolled acres came out to just above 3 million acres. And then adopted acres, their target came out to 215,000. So adopted acres are habitat land. So this is the portion of their enrolled acres where they've adopted those conservation measures on. So that was their target. That was the minimum amount that partners needed to achieve. But the actual adopted acres, what they actually achieved was just below 700,000. So they went well above what they were supposed to and achieved around 222% more acres than they needed to, which is great to see. And on that land, these partners will do effectiveness monitoring, meaning they'll see and track the progress that these activities are having on the land. And so we've had 755 sample plots taken up until the end of 2021. So this graphic kind of shows where those adopted acres are in the country. So it's a nice visual to see where we're actually reaching with this agreement. And I just want to give a shout out to Texas, Ohio, and Michigan as kind of paving the way in the highest adopted acres in the country so far. So you might be wondering, what does it actually look like to enroll your lands in the CCAA? You know, if you're a highway agency or other transportation or energy company, so you have your enrolled lands. That is what's going to be covered by the agreement, and then a subsection of that is your adopted acres. Those are the acres that you perform your conservation measures on. So those adoption rates that are required are what is minimum for the net benefit. So that's how your minimum target is determined. And then on those adopted acres, partners conduct monitoring portions of those. So you can see kind of in the graphic of what that looks like. You have your enrolled acres, then your adopted acres, and then samples will be taken on those adopted acres. So here you can see what it might look like for a transportation and distribution company, what their lands might look like. So they have their full enrolled lands, and then the portion of their lands that they are not considering adopted acres. So, you know, it's really up to the partner on where they want to contribute their adopted acres. So the portion that they would like to continue with the status quo of operations is kind of what you see to the left over there. And then on the right side of the screen, that's what's considered their adopted acres. That's where they'll be doing things like brush removal, timed mowing, targeted herbicide, native seeding, things like that. And this is what it might look like for a generation company. So you have your land here, let's say it's a solar generation company, and you want to have the status quo of your operations be, you know, around your solar panels, and then you can use your other land to put your adopted acres on and do those conservation measures that we've been mentioning. And this is what it might look like for a roadside and other transportation company. So, you know, they might enroll the full width of their of the roadsides, and then mow as normal as status quo, you know, 6-10 feet from the road, and then the rest of their land can be used for adopted acres, doing things like idle buffer lands, brush removal, time mowing, things like that. So really we're just getting across that it's up to the partner of how they want to arrange their adopted acres in respect to their enrolled lands. So to kind of give you a little background of how we got here. So this was, you know, over a two-plus year initiative. So in October of 2017, the task force was formed, and that is when the initial call for funding was put out for this Monarch Butterfly CCAA, and 40 plus industry partners convened and formed an advisory team in February 2018. And then the technical draft was then sent close to a year later in December of 2018. And that had to be opened for a 60-day window for public comment. from April to June of 2019. And then UIC and Cardinal worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to incorporate any final revisions that came from that public comment period from July 2019 to March of 2020. And then in April of 2020, the CCAA received final approval, and that was when partners could start enrolling in the program. And that's also when we received our first application. So this kind of shows the different steps of what it took to get the Monarch CCAA, finally approved. And this is kind of a similar road we might see for the Bumblebee agreement moving forward. And I think with that, I turn it over to Dan.
All right, thanks a lot, Megan. Thanks, Iris. Yeah, so with World Bee Day upon us, it's good. It's a good time to share, the vision we have for this Bumblebee agreement, conservation agreement that builds on that success of the Monarch CCAA. Certainly, it's something that was sort of envisioned, I think, at the onset of the CCAA. And so, as we think about this with sort of our new focus on bumblebees, or the added focus on bumblebees, it goes back to the bumblebees as a group need a lot of the same requirements, or they face a lot of the same threats that monarchs do, right? The list that Megan shared earlier is, for the most part, the same list of threats that the monarch faces, and that, to the extent that we can, through something like the Monarch CCAA, we can address some of those threats on energy and transportation lands. We're trying to do the same thing for bumblebees as well. Take advantage of the engagement that's already within the Monarch CCAA and build upon that to add additional conservation success for other species. And so you see on the graphic here, this is a list of some of the species with IUCN red list status from across North America. So we talk about those North American bumblebees, and you can see they range here from being critically endangered to vulnerable. And of course, those don't all align with necessarily the national or state listing designations, but in the big picture, it illustrates that there is a broad need for these species to have added conservation to address these threats. And so, again, we can hopefully build on the Monarch CCAA to address that through some similar conservation actions. So you might be asking yourself, well, why bees? Why now? I mean, of course, it's World Bee Day, but in the bigger picture, why are we focused on bees? I mean, certainly they're exposed to the same threats. I think, thinking from the aspect of participants that we have within the Monarch CCAA, and I know when we had the earlier poll, at least half of you were have concerns about ESA listings and additional regulations and constraints. That is a big motivator for pursuing an agreement like this right now. And that might seem counterintuitive. There's a lot of other sort of prominent listings that we're hearing about right now. There's the uplisting of the northern long-eared bat. There's the proposed listing for lesser prairie chicken, which I think we'll see here soon, go final. And so each, these aren't the first and won't be the last species to be listed, and each one of these have changes in terms of land management and operations, no matter what lands you manage. But certainly, as we think about energy and transportation lands broadly, these can be costly. They're also costly to agencies, right? For those, from Fish and Wildlife Service or other agencies, every time there's a new listing, that's added work, added coordination that has to happen on projects and with other entities. So that's added workload. Of course, there's the added regulatory risks and disruptions that happen as a result of activities that you have. And with that, then there's operational constraints, partly due from uncertainty of what you may or may not be able to do. And of course, we've heard, there's concerns about doing conservation for listed species that, you could be inviting sort of regulatory risks to yourself. And so having agreements that address those risks and promote conservation are really, really important to eliminate those hurdles to get the conservation done for the species that are in need. I think beyond those, listings we're seeing, we can see existing listings can change also, right? So we talk about the uplisting of the northern long-eared bat, which is currently listed federally as threatened, is proposed for uplisting to endangered. Certainly more closer to home for this, the rusty patch bumblebee is listed currently as an endangered species on the endangered species list. And that species was listed in 2017, and since that time, we've seen this, updates and guidance and recommendations and considerations for, what constitutes take for that species, right? As we learn more about a species, as we see what activities, and how they might affect it, that becomes known. So for this species in particular, there was some updated guidance that came out in December of 2021 that includes this key that we show here that really helps lay out some of the thresholds that would be expected for impacts to the rusty patch bumblebee. And as we think about other bumblebees, I think the rusty patch, is a good indicator of what we might see with other bumblebee listings, right? I mean, at least it's the most sort of widely regionalized species that is currently listed, where we've had to think about these questions in terms of take and how do we address threats and how do we provide conservation for it. So with that, we've been thinking about that species in particular, but of course, the rusty patch is not the only species that's at risk, going back to the IUCN list. And so there's another bumblebee that's currently federally listed, that's the Franklin's bumblebee, out in the Pacific Northwest. But certainly there's several other bees that are petitioned that are undergoing review right now, right, the 12-month finding review. And so you have American bumblebee, the variable cuckoo bumblebee, the western bumblebee, and Suckley's cuckoo bumblebee. And so you can see we have a map here that shows the sort of publicly available records of those species that come through Xerces Society and the Bumblebee Watch Citizen Science Program, as well as records that are recorded through iNaturalist. And these records are all slightly offset just from a data protection standpoint. We don't want to show exactly where these species are, but the areas around which they are. But you can see from this, the different colors indicate different species. It's the red or rusty patch, that sort of purple is American bumblebee. The greenish blue is western bumblebee. And then Suckley's bumblebee have fewer records. There are a couple in there, they're kind of pink colored. But you can see these are widely distributed. I should note too, this is just citizen science records, right? So there's likely additional records of species that either are held by federal agencies or state agencies or tribal agencies as well. So as you think about that, that's something to think about. We do have this map uploaded as a story map. I see Iris, you just chatted that into the chat. So you can check this out for yourself. You can check out the wide ranges of these species, so where they're potentially occurring, but then also a link to this more interactive map that shows this. And so we're looking at a group of different species. And of course, the question is, especially if you're in the group that's thinking about ESA concerns and potential regulations, what does that look like? And what we've seen again through the rusty patch bumblebee, through the current determination key that's included in Fish and Wildlife Service guidance, and through some of the coordination that CCAA partners have been doing with local field offices, these are the types of activities and thresholds which are considered to potentially cause take or may affect the rusty patch bumblebee. And so these in particular occur within, for the rusty patch, what's considered a high potential zone. So you can see this is a snapshot of an online map that Fish and Wildlife Service maintains of what those high potential zones are, how they're mapped and modeled around the Chicago area. And of course, these are present across the range of rusty patch. And these are based on records of where known records of the bees occur, and then modeled sort of ranges around those depending on habitat that's available. And so as we look at what types of things from a land management standpoint, or specifically from an energy and transportation management standpoint, could affect these species, it's things like soil disturbance from access or construction activities. It's mowing or potentially haying if that's a component, depending on where you're at. foraging habitat, and foraging habitat tends to be, grasslands that have flowering plants available for the bees to forage on, throughout the growing season. There is a 2-acre threshold for some of those disturbances to foraging habitat in the key. Of course, broadcast use of herbicides, insecticides is also prohibited through that. So reducing pesticide impacts through more targeted approaches is preferred and allowed under this. But again, limited on broadcast use, as well as conversion of areas of foraging or nesting habitat at any time. And so you can see with these thresholds or these types of activities, those can be fairly limiting on operations and maintenance needs for energy and transportation lands. And those are the kinds of concerns that are raised and things that could prevent people from bringing conservation within this land use context. And of course, we want to avoid that, right? We want to promote conservation. And so that's where voluntary conservation agreements can really be useful. It's really trying to answer that question: how do you promote conservation for a species while also maintaining that ability to manage and maintain the land? And of course, this isn't a new problem or a new question. This is something that is addressed in things like the Monarch CCAA, as well as other conservation agreements. And so these are often referred to as Section 10 agreements because they're authorized through Section 10 of the Endangered Species Act. And the 3 that are most common are these. There's the CCAA, which is the Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances, which again, like the Monarch CCAA that Megan talked about earlier. There's safe harbor agreements. So CCAs and safe harbors are very similar. CCAs being for candidate species, so species not yet listed, whereas safe harbors are for listed species in particular. And then there's also habitat conservation plans, which could be for candidates or listed species. And you can see the table here. We're not going to go through all the details, but there's some nuances that are different between those. I think the biggest one being that CCAAs and safe harbors are really meant for a net benefit, right? You want to do something to benefit the species, to improve it and its habitat conditions, but also do that in a way that also allows you to sort of maintain your land, maintain your property, without further restrictions, right? So do conservation and do beneficial practices to sustain or maintain or improve the species, but not hinder the things you need to do on your own property. Whereas the habitat conservation plans are usually more associated with offsetting impacts. So if you're developing an area, or if there's going to be things that result in impacts as a result of construction or other activities, how do you offset and add conservation to sort of mitigate those losses? And so as we're thinking about this agreement, we're really focused more on that net benefit side, right? We want to improve species so we can either preclude listings altogether, right? Add the conservation that's needed for those species, or help them recover sooner in the case that they are listed. I think the important thing is these are really detailed. They take a lot of time to develop. As we saw with the Monarch CCA, going back to that roadmap that Megan shared, it took a little over 24 months to develop that agreement. And we're expecting about the same time frame for a Bumblebee agreement to be developed and approved and ready for enrollment. Of course, going back to the question of why bees and why now, if we think about some of the upcoming listings, the Western Bumblebee is expected to have a decision in 2024. So if you do the math on that, that means that's 2 years out. And so with the 24-month timeline, now is the time that we need to start focusing on this, to have an agreement in place potentially for the next listing. Of course, we're also considering other bumblebees as those are being considered because they're currently petitioned. And so we want to incorporate those other at-risk bumblebees into this agreement. So now's the time to prepare for it. To talk a little bit more in detail about what we're envisioning at this point, and as I preface this, I do want to say, this is something we're actively in conversation with Fish and Wildlife Service about, as well as other stakeholders that are interested in this agreement. And the ideas we're sharing here are preliminary. They're in development, so there's still details to be worked out, but we wanted to share the vision that we have right now. So one aspect of this is we're envisioning maybe a 2-part conservation agreement. One being a combined safe harbor CCAA, again, to achieve that net benefit. to cover, much like the Monarch CCAA does, operations, maintenance, modernization activities. So that would be for non-federalized activities, whereas specifically for DOTs and highway agencies, because so much of their work is funded through federal dollars, those often require additional Section 7 consultation. And so accompanying this with a programmatic Section 7 consultation for transportation specifically. We'll talk mainly here about the combined CCAA safe harbor, just for the sake of time. But I do want to call attention that we're thinking about this to cover sort of both Section 10 and Section 7. So again, our objectives for doing this are multiple. First is we want to enhance and expand the available bumblebee habitat on energy and transportation lands through that commitment of conservation, right? Through doing that, we want to maintain a public-private partnership between Fish and Wildlife Service, state agencies, and the private sector, working towards voluntary conservation. From an industry perspective, we want to provide that regulatory certainty that allows them operational flexibility to move forward while addressing conservation needs for these species, right? That you know, we're sort of not hindering them in their ability for doing good work. And then again, building on the success that we have seen in the Monarch CCAA as we look towards this. And so one of the main functions we are envisioning right now with this agreement is the idea of a commitment area. So we'll talk a little bit about, as Megan shared, there's adopted acres and the adoption rate that's included within the Monarch CCAA. That comes out of the, that was originally sort of grounded in the all hands on deck paper that you might be familiar with that came out years ago, identifying that there's, if certain land sectors devote a certain amount of land to monarch conservation, then we could achieve, you know, the target numbers for monarchs. There's not that kind of modeling or science available for a lot of bumblebee species. And so instead, we're really focused on within the areas where we know or expect these species to occur, how can we reduce and address those threats through a series of conservation measures? And so that online map that we shared a link to, if you zoom into some areas, like in this case, this is an area of Northern Illinois where we have both Rusty Patch as well as American Bumblebee sort of commitment areas mapped. We have these areas that are roughly about 4 kilometers in diameter with I believe a 1 kilometer buffer around them for additional potential dispersal. And so we're considering these commitment areas for this agreement. And so within these areas where you'd have potential lands enrolled in this agreement, you'd be committing to within the foraging, nesting, overwintering habitats that you might have. So again, thinking of areas of natural cover that might be on you know, energy or transportation lands, you're then committing to doing certain conservation measures to reduce those threats to those habitats for the species. And so as you can see, the conservation measures align in a lot of ways with what we have currently in the Monarch CCAA. Some of the differences being preferring, you know, or seeding in species, plant species that are preferred by bumblebees in particular, to the extent that we know those. Taking some steps to reduce and consider, you know, conflicts with commercial bees, to you know, avoid competition and conflicts between those. And also looking at invasive species prevention, right? So bumblebees are really strongly tied to having diverse floral resources, so having a diversity of flowering plants for pollen and for nectar. And so invasive species, right, can greatly reduce the biodiversity or the plant diversity of an area. And so preventing those new spreads is really important to their conservation. So to kind of illustrate side by side how these commitment areas vary to adopted acres, on the left we have the Monarch CCAA adopted acres, where again, it's sort of a percentage of the lands that are enrolled where you're committed to do conservation measures. Whereas in this Bumblebee agreement, we're envisioning these commitment areas being these sort of spatially defined locations based on known records of these target species. And within those areas where there is potential habitat, again, natural cover suitable for these species, you're committing to doing those similar actions. So on the ground, we think it'll look very, very similar to the Monarch CCAA. It's just how we define where those areas are a little bit different between both. Of course, then there's the question about, well, what about overlap with the Monarch CCAA? Certainly, partners who are enrolled might be interested in you know, participating in both agreements. And in a lot of ways, there's some similarities, right? You know, there's still tracking and monitoring and reporting that has to happen under both agreements. Certainly, there's other agreements that are out there aside from the Monarch CCAA or this agreement where there is overlapping conservation happening for species. And so it's not a new concept. You know, we envision both of these programs being managed through UIC, but it's sort of separate programs. There might be some that are interested just in bumblebee conservation primarily, others focused on monarchs, some wanting to do both. And so we want to account for that and manage these through those different means. Keep them aligned as much as we can, and also, again, building on the success of the Monarch CCAA, think about where we can continue to make the tracking and reporting, those administrative requirements, all the easier. And so when we think about the Monarch CCAA, that requires tracking of conservation measures through you know, a spreadsheet tracking that gets submitted with reporting, noting kind of where those conservation measures occur. Whereas in the Bumblebee agreement, we have spatially explicit areas. Those make reporting a little bit easier, right? We know we're asking you to do certain things in certain locations. So that could be a simple checklist potentially that, yes, we did these things in these locations. Where monitoring for the Monarch CCAA includes milkweed and nectar plants. For bumblebees, that would be more focused on flowering, plant cover, and diversity, right? That's gonna be the important element to capture there. And then annual reporting likely will look very similar, right? Reporting on implementation, challenges experienced, the tracking that was done, the monitoring results, and showing that status on a year-to-year. So like Iris and Megan shared, we can share that story about what people are delivering for conservation for the species. So we're looking to integrate those where we can, but also keep them separate so they can be participated in as people wish. One other aspect that we're excited about with this is thinking about other species. So thinking about how we can consider other species. We noted there's 2 listed bumblebees. There's also several petitioned and undergoing review. Those might not be the last, right? When you look at the IUCN Red List, there's other species that aren't currently petitioned but are vulnerable or at risk. And so we want to leave space in this to accommodate future changes so that we can leverage that conservation for other species as well in the future if need be. And so we've developed this initial set of sort of initial criteria that we're thinking about whereby which we would potentially allow inclusion of species in the future. Of course, they also have to be at-risk species. They have to be affected by the same covered activities that are included in the agreement. They also have to be reasonably expected to have a net benefit from those same conservation actions, right? So if we can address similar threats through similar actions, that makes sense to include in the agreement. Similarly, they have to be sort of, the impacts have to be the same to those species as these other ones. Of course, each species maybe is affected slightly differently, but again, the things that we're addressing in this have to fall within that same framework. And then last, I know the service needs to do their work to evaluate each new species. And so anytime we think about adding species, we have to allow space and time for the service to do their due diligence to review potential impacts, develop incidental take statements, and do things like that to recognize the inclusion of a new species in the agreement. So as we shared, there's a lot of work involved here. This did start, again, this was one of the ideas that came up initially with the Monarch CCAA way back in 2017 when discussions around that started. And at that time, we decided just to focus on monarchs for the scale, but also the simplicity of that agreement. And so now this feels like, we're sort of revisiting that initial idea, and that's really exciting for us that we get to come back to this initial vision that was had for more than just monarchs, right? All pollinators. And so taking that one step further here with bumblebees. And so now that, as Megan shared, we have 2 years of the Monarch CCAA, kind of under implementation, And with new applicants coming each month, it's a good time now to turn to the bumblebees, looking ahead. And so as you look at our timeline here, we've done some initial work to develop some of these ideas that we've shared here today over the past year and this past winter. And so now we're looking for funding to carry this further, to generate support for this. We're exploring how to sort of take this to that next step. And so we're looking to begin the agreement preparation here later this summer and into fall, with an eye on developing and drafting that agreement for Fish and Wildlife Service review by hopefully late spring or next summer. With that kind of time frame, that allows several months for Fish and Wildlife to review, including a public comment period on that agreement, with the hopes that we can have a final agreement in place by spring of 2024. Summer of 2024. And so again, that's right around the same time that we would expect to hear a decision on the western bumblebee. And of course, those are other bees that are petitioned in the meantime as well. So lots of work to be done, and we ask for your support in doing that. And so to talk a little about where we go from here, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Megan, for the next steps.
Thanks, Dan. So now that you've kind of heard, what this agreement is about and what we're thinking in terms of what would be involved in it, you might be interested in how to get involved in this initiative and how to support it. So that online map that Dan went over, I would recommend checking that out to see, where these different species, where they're occurring on the land, and review it to see, if it might affect your company, if you're an energy or transportation land. But this map is comprised of public data, so it's not exhaustive, but it should give you an idea of if a species gets listed, how that would affect you. And please share your feedback with us, any thoughts you have. We're also looking for support through funding, data sharing, or in-kind support, and encourage participation by organizations. We're happy to talk with anyone you think could be of value to this agreement. We'll have our contact information up in a couple slides, and so please feel free to reach out, and we can get a conversation started. So one method of support is funding and in-kind. So we are in phase 1 of this agreement, and so our funding target is $150,000. So we have a suggested funding level to companies of around $5,000 to $20,000, but obviously you can give whatever you want. If you can only offer in-kind support, we'll also accept that as well. We'll have our contact information up on the next slide, and you can reach out to us if you're interested in supporting. So now it's time for questions. So if you want to put them in the chat, we can go through those now. And like I mentioned, there's our contact information, so you can reach out to any of us with any questions you have or feedback.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Megan. There's a couple questions that we've had so far submitted, and encourage others to add others to the chat if they have them. One question is about just overall kind of benefit of a bumblebee agreement. So I'll direct this one to you, Dan. If an organization does not currently have any listed or potentially listed bee species within their existing rights of way, would this mean essentially participating in the CCAA for bumblebees wouldn't have a regulatory benefit to them?
Sure, that's a good question. And I think one way to think about that is, again, as Megan and I mentioned, with that map right now, that's just based on citizen science records. So just because there might not be dots maybe where you operate on that map doesn't mean that there's not species there. If you look at that story map, as you go through it, it'll show the ranges of these species, and you can see one or more of these species do have ranges throughout the country. So I would say, if there's no listed species there, does it still have a regulatory or conservation benefit? I would say yes, because it just takes one record to show up in wherever you operate, and now you have to address that from a regulatory and compliance standpoint. And so, right, if you can promote that conservation and bring that conservation up front, you have the assurances through the agreement, no matter what records are. So it gives you certainty, it gives you predictability. That's always a good thing.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Another question about some of the specific conservation measures that could be included. The question is, would spot herbicide treatments or species-specific herbicide that's being used to remove invasive plant species in, again, some of these commitment areas, would that be allowed under the agreement?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And this is one of those really nuanced details, I'd say, that we're still working through. So I'll caveat my answer with that. But generally, yes, spot treatments of herbicides are the types of things that are allowed. I mean, that's allowed in the Monarch CCAA, and I think we envision similar for the Bumblebee agreement. So, directed spot treatments to a plant is the type of treatments that I think that we're talking about, right? Those effectively reduce exposures. When we get into, it's more of an application focus than formulation, right? Because there's broadly specific herbicides that could be applied in a broadcast fashion. And so even though they're targeting invasives, they also might be impacting the other floral resources that the bees are using. And so that's where we have to be careful about applying it in a broadcast fashion, even if it is, a target-specific formulation.
And I'll just add, I think addressing invasive species issues certainly, I think, is an important part of what we would be trying to address through conservation activities, certainly because that is a threat to the habitat resources that bees and monarchs benefit from.
Yeah.
Another question, do we envision the Bumblebee agreement being a single CCAA/safe harbor agreement with Fish and Wildlife Service?
Yes. Yeah. I could just leave it there. Yes, we envision it.
Short answer, yes, a single agreement.
The short answer is
building on.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, the long answer is that yes, because some of those candidates may indeed become listed at some point in the future. And so having it as a combined agreement, again, allows that predictability, that consistency, no matter the status.
Okay. A related question, this is coming from a potential applicant, would be if there was an organization that was interested in participating both in the Monarch CCAA and this new Bumblebee agreement, what would the application process look like? Would there be a single kind of integrated application process? And again, I think that's a great question. I think we're still trying to work through some of those details, but I think our hope would be to streamline and integrate those processes as much as possible. Again, one of the benefits of managing the programs together would be, I think we hope to look for some of those efficiencies, both in the application process as well as the reporting and monitoring. But Megan or Dan, is there anything you would add to that?
Well, I guess I would add that, the Bumblebee agreement isn't set to be open for enrollment for another 2 years. So if you're, really interested in the Monarch CCAA and joining that, I would recommend, joining that sooner rather than later, because the Bumblebee agreement wouldn't be ready for another 2 years.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think we do envision some discounts and other benefits for existing Monarch CCAA partners once the Bumblebee agreement is available. So you wouldn't miss out on that per se. Here's a question about the programmatic Section 7 approach that you mentioned, Dan. The suggestion is it possible that that programmatic Section 7 could be expanded beyond highway entities, perhaps to include federal land management agencies? Is that something we've considered?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say there's that would be a consideration. I think why we've been focusing currently on transportation is because, I think transportation agencies are used to that. There's some other programmatics for species that have been developed through the Highways Administration. And again, there's a lot of federal funding that drives that. So there's been interest there, but certainly you're right, that same programmatic consultation could occur for other federal land managing agencies as well. It's just in terms of, I think, currently interest and focus, the transportation area is one that I know, we've heard a lot of interest on that side.
Okay. Thanks, Dan. A couple questions about the enrollment and kind of funding process. So one question is, Megan, you touched on the fact that we have an open call for funding for the phase 1 development of the Bumblebee agreement. Just to confirm, we don't anticipate that, similar to the Monarch CCAA, the Bumblebee agreement will be limited to only those organizations that fund the development of the agreement. So while we are reliant on our industry partners to support the development of the agreement, we do envision that it will be open to any eligible energy or transportation organization once the Bumblebee agreement is completed. As far as timing for when the applications for the Bumblebee agreement would become available, again, I think, Dan, you spoke to this, probably earliest would be 2024 sometime.
The agreement will become available in 2024. The first listing, which is, listing decision is due, is Western Bumblebee, which is expected 2024. Of course, that'd be a proposed decision. So hypothetically, if the Western Bumblebee was proposed to be listed at that time in 2024, the service has up to 12 months to make that decision final. And so, that could allow, for any entities that are operating within the Western Bumblebee region, to enroll, have about a year to enroll prior to a listing. And certainly you can enroll after a listing as well with a safe harbor agreement.
Okay. And that's maybe another important distinction. There's another question kind of to this effect, that with the existing Monarch CCAA, enrollment is only open until the effective listing for the Monarch. And so again, there's this possibility that if the Monarch is listed in 2024, which is the current time frame, that the door would close on the Monarch CCAA around the time, or even potentially before, the Bumblebee agreement is finalized. So if you're thinking about wanting to participate in both, again, that's something to consider. Okay, there's a couple of other questions that have come in that, just looking at the time, I don't know that we'll be able to get to, but we will circle back and follow up by email with those of you who have questions we didn't get to. Again, want to thank you all for your time and interest, and some really good discussions here at the end. So we will be back in touch with those of you, and also make available the recording of today's webinar and the slides if there's interest in that. One final reminder, when we end the webinar here today, you'll have a survey pop up, hopefully, if all goes well. And I think it's just 3 or 4 questions. If you could take just a couple minutes and respond to that survey, we'd appreciate that feedback. And that will also help inform how we reach out to you guys in the future about this Bumblebee agreement. So appreciate your input there. And again, thanks to Dan and Megan for your presentations today, and thanks to all of you for participating. We look forward to working with you on this exciting project going forward. Have a good afternoon.